Shamina heads the Center for Inclusive Growth at Mastercard. You're also the EVP for Corporate Sustainability at Mastercard. So let's talk about both of those roles and why it makes sense for one person to wear both hats. Tell us first about the Center for Inclusive Growth and specifically, how does it differ from other corporate philanthropy efforts? Because it is the corporate philanthropy arm of the company, correct?
Yeah. So thanks for having me here, and I'll try to make my comments interesting and relevant after the after lunch crowd. Try to keep you awake, but I do think that the work of the center is unique in the sense that we're actually established as an independent subsidiary of Mastercard, but we sit inside the company, so we're an LLC, and our remit is global in scope, and is actually required to use the assets of the firm for social impact. So before we were capitalized this past year, we actually had very little money, and so
go around with your tin cup.
Actually, no. It made us actually really think through things like data and data analytics. So that's when we really started using the framing around information inequality, data philanthropy, actually thinking about real hardcore assets of the company and how you do use those for social impact. And so I think in our first incarnation, we were actually pretty creative in the way that we really thought about social impact and thought about the assets of the company. But I do think it's an interesting approach to social impact because at the same time as we have the Mastercard Foundation, which is a completely separate entity that sits in Toronto and was created from Mastercard stock, for those of you who don't know, and now is what, Olga, who's my colleague here, valued at something like $30 billion. That's what you get when you get capital philanthropy. And so the opportunity for us at the center was to think about, with this new world of digitalization and technology and institutions that need to change and everything that needs to change, what is it about philanthropy that we need to make sure that we're thinking about changing? So that's sort of how we got started.
And the opening speaker this morning, Professor George Serafim, talked a lot about making sure that social goals align with the broader corporate goals. Yeah. So just talk a little bit about how in creating the mission for the Center for Financial Inclusion, and it's fairly obvious, I think, to everyone in the room why MasterCard would care about financial inclusion, but can you talk a little bit about how you tried to make sure that you aligned the center's goals with the broader corporate goals?
Yeah, so it was actually pretty easy because the work of the center actually came at the end of a conversation. So the social impact at MasterCard started at the beginning on the business side. So when Ajay Banga became CEO almost 10 years ago, one of his first things was creating a strategy based on a world beyond cash, the disruption of cash as the business strategy for MasterCard, the company. So, as you said, if you're a digital payments company that has global remit, the idea of cash being your competition becomes pretty evident and creates a pretty long runway. So that was the frame that Ajay and our CFO actually used with shareholders and things like that to get their heads around what it looks like to have near-term growth and growth for the future. And so that's when we launched our initiative around financial inclusion, committed to bringing 500 million people into the formal economy, committed to bringing 40 million new merchants into the formal economy, all made long-tail economic business sense. And then the center came later. And so I started out on the business side. And then what we found was that we were, because of the work we were doing on social subsidy digitization with governments around the world, we were learning a lot in real time that we didn't necessarily have a place to deposit the learnings. And so our board said, why don't you create something that you can open source the learnings and the knowledge so that as people come up behind you in the payment space around financial inclusion, they're not reinventing the wheel.
Sounds like a pretty great board.
Yeah.
So talk about the other hat you wear, which is EVP of Corporate Sustainability. Just briefly talk about that job, but more importantly, why the Center for Inclusive Growth and why these two roles belong together.
So everybody in here knows the role of ESGs, and they're certainly becoming more relevant and more, on the tops of people's minds with investor. And so we really think about they're going hand in hand. I have this fantasy that, the SDGs and the ESGs will actually somehow come together, and we can start measuring our impact across the board. That's the vision. So it's sort of like, how are we, and that's why we're together. So how are we making sure that as much as we are doing the work that around environmental, social, and governance, that we're also making sure that the S portion, or the SDGs, the global goals, are equally part of the solution. So one can't exist without the other. And so that's why they exist together here. But again, I think that this idea, just to put a finer point on it, it is this idea that we're not separate from the company. So this CSR, social impact, all of these things, we actually live in a business unit inside the company and are regularly called upon for advice from management committee, the board, and things like that, alongside our business colleagues.
Do you think that makes you more effective than your counterparts who may not necessarily wear a corporate hat or who are siloed off from management teams?
I think it makes us a little bit more evolved in the process. Like, this is where it's going. So we just are going there sooner rather than later. Until, I think, as long as, and an example of this is because we have to, as everybody's talked about technology and finance and things like that, unless social impact is going right alongside our business colleagues, we're missing a trick in terms of how we serve populations better. And so an example around this is we started doing much more work around private-private partnerships. And so I was talking earlier about our partnership with Unilever, and the idea that, there are shop owners in Unilever's supply chain that can't stock their shelves fast enough because they don't have loans and they don't have collateral to get the loans from the banks. And so if they don't get a loan from a bank, they end up borrowing from, 3 or 4 other lenders at very high interest rates. And, the cycle of debt continues. So we went to Unilever and said, look, what if we were able to look at the data in your supply chain around the buying habits of the shopkeepers in your supply chain and use that data as proxy for credit score, package it up, take it to our partner bank, in this case, Kenya Commercial Bank, and use that as a way to open accounts for them and provide credit at reasonable interest rates to buy more goods and goods from Unilever. And the upside of that is that Unilever won because they sold more products. The shop owner won because their sales have increased somewhere around 20%. And the banks are winning because for many years and all the time they say it's very hard, it's cost prohibitive to bank this level of micro merchant. And so sort of reducing the cost and reducing the risk of banking those micro merchants, creates a good situation for the bank. And ultimately, I think for Mastercard as a company, we want those people digitized down the road. Now, is it going to be near-term big profit for the company? Maybe not. But from a social impact perspective, what it's allowed us to do is what the previous panel described before: unlock credit for a population that heretofore has had a very difficult time accessing formal credit.
I'm so glad you started talking about micro businesses and smaller businesses. There have been a number of questions in the room during the morning about the challenge of small organizations working with big organizations. And I'd love to get your thoughts in your experiences at Mastercard, but also working in the public sector, about what are the things that smaller organizations can do to better partner with big organizations, and how do big organizations avoid smothering the small ones? Because clearly, just based on what we've been hearing in this room, there is a desire for the small to learn from the big, but also partner with the big.
Yeah, no, I think, look, we're a small organization inside a big company. So we're the poster child for how a small organization doesn't get smothered by the big company, but learns and somehow, and really lives inside that ecosystem. And I think the same is true for the model, right? So it's like, when we were starting with the center, and Olga, it's like, when you're trying to figure this stuff out, you can't just look at the big organizations. In fact, you don't look at the big organizations for necessarily innovation on the edge. That's the whole purpose of new fintech companies, and that's where the innovation is. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily competition, because ultimately what you want to do is either absorb the technology, absorb the learnings, scale it, grow it in some way. And so I think, at least for us, they're essential, different sizes, diversity of people, diversity of business size, diversity of scope and scale are essential to the innovation economy. And so I think we're pretty clear that we'll get eaten alive if, as a company, we don't figure this out. But I also think I've seen plenty of, I was talking, one of the smaller nonprofits that we partner with is this organization called Mandeshi Bank in India. And if you've never heard of Chetna Sinha, look her up, because she's our North Star. She's my North Star, because she's the one who said, don't make poor products for poor people. You have to put people at the center of your process. And these are the people who are working on the front line. So, who are we to say that we have the answers when they're the ones who actually do the work?
What are some of the things that you've done at the Center for Inclusive Growth to ensure that MasterCard is a good partner when it goes out into the world, whether it's partnering with the Unilevers on a private-private partnership, or as you look to deploy your capitalization now that you have it, working with either NGOs or governments? What are the best practices you've deployed to make sure that you're pulling your weight as a partner and being a good steward?
I would imagine it's what any of us do to pull our weight as a good partner and a good steward. We show up with our best selves. And so, our remit is just that, is that when we show up as the center, we're showing up with the best assets of the firm. So we're showing up with capital, but we also show up with data and data analytics, with technology, and with people. And so we bring all of those efforts to bear in places where we can make a difference. So that's the other piece of this, is that we're not solving malaria per se, but we can certainly help figure out how to deliver immunizations in a way, or immunization records in such a way that they're portable and they travel with the patient. Because that's what a company who deals in transactions and authentication and buying and selling and trust can do. We're not the doctors, but we are the foot soldiers. But we're digital foot soldiers who can do it in thousands of records per second. So it's sort of like figuring out what you're good at, and then how that thing can be helpful at scale to other people, other organizations, I think is how we do it. And the other thing I'll just say is that for me personally, I'm not a finance person. So sorry, Olga, I'm not even an MBA. But I actually started, and I think this is what's interesting about the colleagues, the people who are being attracted to the space. I come out of labor organizing and political organizing. And so I think it's that skill set of issue advocacy, organizing, understanding how assets need to be aggregated, how to move an agenda, whether it's policy, advocacy, or business. Those are the types of skill sets I think that you need when you're thinking about these new ways of doing work around the world.
What are the lessons that you have learned from some of you mentioned earlier, where the innovation is, the fintech startups, the entrepreneurs, either from a practical standpoint or from a leadership standpoint? What are some of the best practices that you have gleaned from the smaller or the entrepreneurial companies that you've brought to Mastercard, where, again, you are sort of the entrepreneur inside the big organization?
So, and this is actually an example from Include, which is a company that is now working with Palladium. Lori Spengler, who can't be here, who is on sabbatical, is one of the smartest people I know in this space. She really helped us think about what finance looks like for for small businesses. And so worked with her very closely to sort of say, look, and the team, Roland's here, I see other people are here, to sort of identify the segment. And I'll just give an example rather than a big lesson, but the segment of small businesses who have a propensity to grow. We call them strivers. And so what we realized is that everybody always talks about small businesses being the backbone of every economy. That's true. But there's a segment of these small businesses that actually need the lift because they're the ones who are on the verge of greatness, on the verge of scale, on the verge of moving from the formal to the informal to the formal and things like that. So being able to identify that segment of small business has become our goal in life. And so we're trying to really, because of the lessons and the work that we've been doing, have really come to the understanding that our intervention will have the most bang for the buck if we can segment this segment of strivers and really work with good organizations and good people to figure out how to lift them up, to get them the financing and get them the marketing and get them the learnings that they need to actually grow. But that's just one. I mean, complementary assets are another thing. It's like if you're going to partner with somebody, make sure you have complementary assets. Make sure you have the same commitment to values. I think that's the other piece of this that's really important, is that if you're partnering with another organization and they don't share your view of the world, then you're not going to have a very fruitful partnership.
How do you measure for that? Particularly if it's not a partner that you've worked with before. Is it gut? Are there metrics that you can use to figure out if you'll be compatible? It's like a dating app, I guess.
Yeah, it is. I mean, look, I think for all the data in the world, right, how does business get done? It's two people sit down and have a conversation about a number of different things. So that people will say, that's not scalable, Shamina. Well, guess what? If it's the right two people, you can have a huge scaled impact. If it's two big fat companies and a third big fat government, you're impacting many people around the world. And so I would sort of say, don't forget that when people talk about private sector, public sector, government, it's all people. It's a person behind that conversation. And so it's really important, I think, to have the relationship with people who can make a difference.
You mentioned scale, which is, of course, a big theme of the day here today. How do you prioritize scale? When you're going into a new initiative or you're experimenting with something, is scale the first thing you're thinking about? Can this scale? Or are there other priorities that come first? And if the experiment is successful, then you think about the scale?
Well, I'd be interested what other folks think, but I think for us at the center, the first lens is inclusive growth. So we think about financial inclusion as the pathway out of poverty. And so what we know about the statistics looks like we might get there by 2020 or a little bit later, but inclusive growth being the pathway from out of poverty to shared prosperity. And that's sort of the path to 2030. So for us, that's the lens that we're looking at, is does it fit that criteria for us? Now, does it, once we get past that, so that's why you sort of think about health, and it's not health per se, but it's what's the financial inclusion component to that health partnership, and figuring out where our intervention is. Now, once we figure out that there is a place for us in the conversation, then it becomes pretty easy to figure out if we actually can do something. It's always because I think that's the big question is everybody, people love to have conversation and say, hey, I don't know how many emails let's find a synergistic conversation to have about the buzzword of the buzzword of the buzzword of the buzzword. And then I answer with, yes, let's have the synergistic buzzword. And then we figure out, and then we have a conversation, and then we figure out if we can actually do something together. But I think that the first piece is figuring out, is there an intervention? Are we complementary? And then, usually if those two things are right, then you can pretty much figure out, is there a scale opportunity, or can it be replicated somewhere else?
Do potential partners now really understand what the Center for Inclusive Growth can do in terms of, again, the interventions, using the network's ability, being expert in data, versus are they coming to you because they think you have money to offer?
Well, I'll send it to the Mastercard Foundation for money. Go to the foundation if you're looking for capital, because they have it, and they're focused on Africa, so go that way. But no, I don't think anybody knows about the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. So I don't think that there is any realization that we're doing anything in the space. So
when the email comes in with the buzzword about the buzzword about the buzzword,
it's usually because Olga has sent them my way, or it's usually because another colleague has said, "Oh, I can't answer your question. Go talk to the center." But no, I think that there is a recognition that that we're out here and we're doing some interesting things, and I think that, and I hope at least that folks understand that we have a theory of the case, right? So we have an actual, we did spend some time thinking through what our view of the world is, and our view of the world is that there are networks that power the modern economy, and your proximity to these networks determines your success. So there are networks that could be informal networks like social media networks and things like that. There's formal networks like financial networks. We concentrate on financial networks, but that doesn't mean that the other networks aren't as important. But it's a worldview that sort of says if we can reduce the barriers, if we can reduce access and proximity to these networks, then we're doing some things right. But that aligns, again, with MasterCard's view of the world, because the view of the world is a networked view.
Shamina, tell us a little bit about your background. You spent 15 years in the public sector, and then you moved over to the private sector. What drew you to public life, and then what got you into I guess you were at Nike, out of public life.
So I think that here's the secret is that I'm really a subversive. So I am a mentor of mine. I used to work for this woman named Ann Richards, who was the governor of Texas. Has anybody heard of Ann Richards? Okay, now you got the audience. There you go. So, when I was 10 years old, no, I'm just kidding. But when she was governor of Texas, I left Virginia and moved to Texas to work for her because I thought she was incredible. And so, and she ended up becoming my mentor for the rest of her life. And her thing was all about networks. She said, if you don't have a seat at the table, I have to make a seat for you. But she was a very strong mentor, and she said, when I worked on political campaigns, I did a lot of work on the public sector side, and in 2005, I was having a career crisis like we all do every day, and I said, I had my big ideas, and I said, Governor Richards, I think I want to become a fundraiser. And she said, why do you want to become a fundraiser? I said, because they make all the money on the political side of the house. Like, that's where the development is. And she said, okay, do me a favor. Call 10 people that can be your friends. Ask them for anything. She was like, you ask them for a ride to the airport. Ask them for, anything. And ask them for $1, ask them for charity. And she said, and then come back to me and tell me if you want to be a fundraiser, and I'll help you get a job. Well, I realized pretty quickly I hate asking for things. So I was like, yeah, not going to happen. And she said, okay, this didn't happen exactly in this order, but she said there was lots of advice going on. But she said, listen, learn how money moves. And she said, if you want to make real change as a policymaker, learn how money moves, because that's where people have to have economic security in order to do anything. And she said women have to have it more than anybody else. When she left the governorship in Texas, she was broke because she'd been a mom, and then she'd been a public servant. Then she was divorced. Then she was governor. And so she sort of said, she said, you have to be economically independent and secure, and you have to learn about money. So I went to work for a bank. So I went to work for Citibank, and I was like, this is great. 2005, I went to work for Citibank, and then the rest is history.
But you were still you did community work inside Citibank, right?
Right, exactly. I helped them reach
you were on the lefty part of the of the bank.
I will tell you, here's the thing. The thing about working for a bank is that you learn a lot. And I was there during the financial crisis. So talk about getting an MBA in real time and having a front seat to what's happening. It was incredible. And the other thing I'll say is this. It's like, once an activist and once a social justice, organizer, always. Because during the financial crisis, I wrote a letter to the CEO of Citi at the time. And I said, here's what I think you should do. If you want to, all this stuff is going to be going on for a long time here. I said, I think you should leave New York and go around the country and go talk to people and understand what's happening to them because of the financial crisis. And he was like, and he answered, and he was like, why should I do that? And I said, because when you go testify, because you're going to have to testify, and when you raise your right hand, you're going to want to be able to say, Congresswoman so-and-so, Elizabeth Warren, blah, blah, blah. When I was in your district, I heard from your constituent about what was going on. And here's what I heard, and here's what we're doing about it. So it's about proximity, and it's about relationship. But it's also about using your voice. And so, anyways, Ajay found out about it. He was the CEO of Mastercard at the time.
I have to ask first, did he take your advice?
Yeah, we spent 6 months on the road together. So we went to, and here's the other interesting thing. Most people in the country had not met the CEO of the bank. And so most of the employees. And so this was the first time actually meeting the CEO of the bank. So it had a double impact effect. But yeah, we spent 6 months on the road.
Right. And then Ajay heard about it.
Yeah, Ajay was at Mastercard at the time, and he was running the consumer bank. And so when he left to become the CEO of Mastercard, I followed him about a year and a half later.
Great. Yes.
No, time's up. So I got.
Over the next 5 years, how would you declare what your success has been in the job?
So we have some hardcore metrics, right? So we know that we said 500 million, so we're measuring for that. We're over halfway there. So for 5 years from now is almost to 2030. So we're using the Sustainable Development Goals as part of our metrics too. So we're benchmarking against the poverty rates. We're benchmarking against women's inclusive growth. We're benchmarking against the Striver Initiative. And so we have a couple of metrics that we're using. But honestly, I think that we'll know when we'll know success when we see that people are living a better life. And so what we're trying to capitalize on, at least what I'm trying to capitalize right now, is what's going to be happening, what is happening in Asia right now with people moving from not our version of poverty to middle class, but a version of increased purchasing power. And so how are we ensuring that the stability and the social institutions and the things that they need are there so that we don't end up with a disaster like we've seen in other places when people have moved up the income spectrum? So it's a great question. It's hard and soft, I guess. But maybe you have advice for me that you can tell me.
Not at all. I'm just trying to get some percentages to get a sense of, as a CEO, how you're driving the process to ensure that you meet those goals that you're trying to meet.
When I find a CEO, are you a CEO?
Not yet.
Okay, me neither. So maybe we can have a conversation and figure it out. Right. So in terms of the, in all seriousness, though, we do have we have an M&E framework, and we have a pretty serious M&E framework that we're measuring all of the impact of not only the financial contributions but the non-financial contributions. And so we have some metrics that we're looking at around strivers, actually, that I'm hoping that we can really make a big bet on creating a movement of strivers. We actually have some work that we're doing in the United States around the impact of investment in economically distressed communities, specifically around opportunity zones. And so we have some work that we're doing with our data and data analytics to actually create long-term investment in opportunity zones. So we have some pretty hardcore things that we're looking at. Thank you, sir.
Time for one more quick question. Yes, in the back in the teal jacket. Just project.
So sometimes we, especially when it comes to the poor, reaching the poor and all those things, people design solutions and it is more of a prescriptive behavior, say this is good for the poor, but not very much in their engagement, what the real problems they face, how to really, what can help them. So what is your process of engaging poor communities or the people you're designing solution for? How do you engage them?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think it's always the central organizing question. And I think that, so not only in the product, so in fact, that's what Olga does. So if anybody wants to learn what we're doing at the base of the pyramid, she's the one to ask. They've spent many hours and years either with direct access and direct research, but also aggregating all the research around what are the the best practices. Here's what's interesting. Because it's a payments company, we have people all over the world, and so we have an ability to go anywhere and have these conversations, and that's kind of what we've done, is done firsthand research and firsthand interviews and market research, applying the same things we would apply for commercial benefit for the most profitable things at Mastercard to the potentially least profitable but most impactful things. So market research for affluent customers, market research for people at the base of the pyramid. Here's an interesting thing too, because it's not only products and services, but it's also our approach. So ID, a lot of people talk about centralized ID. No, decentralized ID is actually the way that people deserve to own their own identification. Just because they're poor doesn't mean you centralize and give access to one source. So it's the same principle. Data privacy by design. Privacy by design. Plan privacy into your business strategy for data. Don't plan to have everything running out everywhere. Plan for people to own their data. And then you create profit around that. That's the way we're approaching not only the product piece, but also data, AI, machine learning, all of these things. We plan for the person in the center, not the other way around.
Shamina, thank you so much for your time and for all of your great thoughts. Really appreciate you being here.